Good morning, everyone, and welcome to a special edition of the Varietal Show. My name is Carl Giavanti. I'm a winery publicist in Willamette Valley, and I'm here with show host Chris Sawyer, fondly known as Sawyer Somm. And this retrospective tasting of the 2014 Willamette Valley vintage is part of a month-long celebration for Oregon Wine Month. Yes, Pinot Noir, of course. And we're going to be going through these 2014s with special guest Janie Brooks of Brooks Winery, Steve Lutz of Lenne Estate, Adam Campbell, Elk Cove, and Dan Warnshuis of
Utopia Vineyards.
There's my intro. Chris, you ready to get the show started?
I am so ready. I am super excited about this, and thank you so much, Carl. Just to start out, everyone, I want to just say that I am a big fan of Oregon wines. Yes, I do live in Sonoma County, but I did live in Oregon at one point in the area of Astoria, Oregon. I get the chance to go up there every now and then. And this year, thanks to Carl, I was up there judging a great competition. I got to meet Steve and Dan. I've known Janie and Adam for a long time. And I really felt that this was a great show to bring us all together. There's a lot of things that, sometimes you have to go to Oregon to be reminded of how great Oregon is. I am consistently drinking Oregon wines, but sometimes you just have to get the feel of how great the people are there, and you just start missing them. And I got the opportunity to go up there, and I will say that it was my first trip outside California when I came up to visit Carl and everyone else, and it really was a great relaxing experience, but also a learning experience. And that's why I felt like we should put together a great show like this to kind of cap off Oregon Wine Month, but also get the point across to you that every month is Oregon Wine Month. And that's really the important part about what we're going to be talking about today. So we also thought we'd throw in a fun little twist to this, not only talk about, how great these wineries are, but also let's talk about the appellations and the sites where these wines are from that are really important, because when we talk about Willamette Valley, we think about a big area there. And to be really honest, it was the first appellation to really kind of include many different counties. The first was actually Carneros, and that included Napa and Sonoma County, and that was 1983. But and we'll go into this in a little bit more detail, but Willamette is 5 counties, and it was also in 1983. And we'll talk a little bit more about that and the history of the making of that original appellation and why we're talking about such a microcosm of different areas. But I think that the other great thing about it is just that it has such unique kind of temperature up there and soil types that are very, very different than California. And when we get into this, we're going to learn a lot about these individual sites and why these wines that we're going to be tasting from the 2014 vintage, that's right, you heard me, 2014. So we threw in another little ringer here that we decided that, I think that it was a great group decision, but to be really honest, last year was really hard for all of us, and I got to enjoy a lot of great wines down here in my cellar, and sharing them with others meant a lot. And it was also great to find out how well these wines from Oregon really age, and it's really one of the tributes to Oregon about the risks are worth the reward. Let's just put it that way as a bold statement. But they certainly are. And I think that what you're going to learn from each one of these people is it was risky, especially in the beginning. And I'll tell you, like Adam's family is like one of the pioneers. And we're just, in my opinion, we're probably crazy doing these things, but they did it. And that's the important thing. They did it. And look at where we're at today. So I think we've got some really great things. So I'm going to do just a quick introduction to Adam real quick, just because I think we'll go in that kind of an order thing about how I've known Adam the longest, and just a quick brief on Adam. Adam started, he graduated from high school in 1989. I was an 87 boy, so he's a little bit younger than me, but we did get to know each other right away when he took over the winemaking helm at Elk Cove. And Elk Cove Winery is a great winery, everyone. I can't tell you enough about how much I respect this winery, and how long I've been tasting these wines with Adam has been an amazing thing. We'll talk about IPNC, which is the International Pinot Noir Celebration. Their family has been a big part of that as well. And it's always been a great thing to learn from Adam and his family. It's just been really something. We're going to go really in detail about a special vineyard from him. From there, I will definitely go to Janie, who I love so much, and she's a dear friend of mine. And Janie's gone to Telluride Wine Festival with me, and we've had so many fun times. Her brother Jimmy was a very dear friend of mine. He passed away, and Janie had a decision to make about keeping the winery afloat, and she did it. And we're all lucky she did, because these wines are amazing, and we'll go into a little bit more detail about. They're also great farmers. So, I mean, everyone's got to be a great farmer to make wine. And I think that that's one of the reasons, too, that these 4 people are so important to me, because they are farmers first. You can't make great wines without great grapes, and it just doesn't happen that way. In the case of Steve, Steve and I have become friends just recently, but I'll tell you, we hit it off pretty big right away. We had a great time. It was a super rainy day. Right after I had seen Dan, and I'll get to Dan in a second, but Steve and I had a fantastic time with my great friend Jeff Garner, and it was super rainy, letting these people in. They needed to be mopped off and everything, but they were fantastic, and the wines were exceptional. So one thing about Adam and Steve is that they're also part of the Yamhill Carlton appellation, which is a very special one. So we're going to be talking about 2 different areas there. Janie, on the other hand, is part of the Amity Iola Hills appellation. So that's a different one. We're going to start out with Janie. But the other one, which I feel is very special, is Dan. And Dan, we got to start off our day with Carl taking us up to visit Dan. We had an amazing time up there. We're talking about Ribbon Ridge. So we're going to go into a little bit of detail in just a second about Dundee Hills and how it kind of all started there at Dundee Hills. But really, this is the higher kind of area there above Dundee Hills, and it really has a lot to do with the lifting and the elevation there. The soils are very unique. It took Dan a little while to find this place, and we'll ask him that question too, because that's a very interesting little story in itself. But I really appreciate all 4 of these amazing proprietors and winemakers to be with us today, because it's just a special thing to not only just educate you as the great group out there that watches the Varietal Show, but also to kind of get into the heads of these amazing people and make you want to go meet them like I met them, and to drink these wines and to have a fun time, and to also learn about how we can age wines and why Oregon Pinot Noirs are specifically very good to age, and especially on the right vintages, as we'll discuss. So without further ado, thank you, all 4 of you, for being here, and you too, Carl. So let me just kind of give you a guideline here about how we're going to start this. I just want to give you a little synopsis of the Oregon history here. So we have a situation there in Oregon where it is much higher elevation than California. We know California, Russian River, and Carneros, and Santa Barbara County, and Anderson Valley, all these great places where we grow Pinot Noir. Guess what? It's pretty ripe down here. We can ripen stuff, and our season is quite long. The problem in Oregon is it's a shorter season. If you really look at it, when our bud break starts here in California, it's about a month before Oregon. So they've gotten a disadvantage. So in the early days, being a UC Davis graduate myself, I felt like they kind of threw Oregon under the bus. The wineries there, or the winemakers, who were saying you can't grow grapes there. It's just not going to work. The northern part of Oregon just will not work. But that changed a little bit. We had an amazing person named David Lutz, who said, screw the system, I'm going to go there, and I'm going to try it, and I'm going to do it. And he did. And this was an amazing situation where he became the pioneer who really went up there. There's also another man named Mr. Sommers who was doing a similar thing down in the Umpqua Valley. And he was also a UC Davis graduate, but it is a little bit warmer down there. So you start out with a little bit of a problem there. You're taking a risk right off the bat. You had some of the other people that followed. It's Adam's family, the Campbells. You had the Sokol-Blauser family. You had the Ponzis and others. And these are really important. Got to say David Adelsheim's name, or else I'll be strangled by David Adelsheim himself. But the fact is that what made it unique was there's very unique soil types, and we're going to go into that in detail. But probably the more important thing is the coastal influence there. So there's an area called the Van Duzer corridor, and it's where the kind of the wind comes in from the ocean. The coastal range is fairly high, and we'll talk to Adam a little bit about that because he's the closest vineyard to the coast. It's about 45 miles from his place to Tillamook, Oregon, and that is the Tillamook cheese, Oregon. Indeed, you guys. I love those cheeses, and I think everyone else out there knows Tillamook name. But that is about 45 miles due west from where Adam's at. Very interesting there. But probably the more important thing is the Missoula Floods. They were a very interesting process that happened millions of years ago, but it kind of came out of the area where Montana is, and they were huge glaciers that kind of came through and cut through basically what is Oregon and the Willamette Valley, cut it out. So it became formed in many ways by that. But the rest of it was pushed up from the bottom of the ocean, just like a lot of the areas here in Sonoma County and California coastline. It's the same thing. So these are parts of under the ocean that were slid upwards and created into mountains. And I think that Dan is going to have a really good perspective on that, especially being on Ribbon Ridge, which is a really exciting area there in Oregon. But I think as far as going, one of my favorite stories ever is one that everyone tells the same story, and it's about the building of the coalition of great vintners that started with the Sokol-Blausers and Ponzis and Campbells and everything. And they used to have these meetings in the Tigard fire station. Oh yeah, Tigard fire station. That was where they would all meet up. They'd have a great time. They'd talk about ideas. They'd talk about the wire that they could get for free because they're going to bush vines instead of string beans now. So let's just do this. And really kind of started on the down low, but sharing ideas. And I feel that this is a really great thing about Oregon, and why getting these four on here was just, it was kind of simple because they like talking about these things, and they like to be friendly with each other and to learn from each other. And they love to showcase why their sites are very specific to them. So this is a great thing. The other part I just want to kind of comment on was what I said about the appellation itself. So Dundee Hills is this area right outside of the little town of, there is a town of Dundee, but Newburgh is probably the bigger town right before you get to it. And, it's a cute little town, very, very quaint, but it's really the soil types there and really what was happening in those hillsides and being researched by David Lett and the others, the Sokol-Blauser family right there. And it was really kind of the first focus was on Dundee Hills, and everyone loved Dundee Hills, and it was just going to be the biggest thing ever. And I think that the biggest lesson I ever learned about the making of these appellations was David Adelsheim stopping everyone in their tracks and saying, you guys, I know you love that area so much. I think it's great. But the thing is, we need to look at the bigger picture. Look at Burgundy. What is Burgundy? Burgundy is a big thing. And then they make little small pockets in there and they find out what defines them. And I think that was probably one of the greatest things that ever happened in the history of Willamette Valley, is for David Adelsheim to take that moment and stop them in their tracks and say, we can design other appellations if we really put our heads down and just do it. And I feel like he really made a big difference there in doing that. Another great thing that I'll say is, it started to gain momentum there in the 80s and especially in the 90s and right around when Adam came into being there, when his dad started planting the vineyard that we're going to talk about in 1989. It was really starting to catch fire there. And we were really going into a stage there that was really interesting. Now, the problem is that there's a lot of the clonal material. These are plant material that comes over from France, and we propagate it usually through UC Davis, is where a lot of the original clones came in. Pomard, the Martini clone, some of the special selections like Calera, and Pizzoni and all these Swan, of course. They're very interesting little cuttings, and they can work and they can give you different flavor profiles. The problem was that Oregon needed a solution to the problem that they have a short season. How can we do something that will make it work there and give us a shorter time period to ripen these grapes? And that was the development of a very special program in Oregon State University, which is now the epicenter of the learning process for up and coming winemakers in Oregon is Oregon State, but it really had nothing. And in fact, David Adelsheim told me that the guy that they were working with was a dairy guy. He was like a dairy specialist from Washington State, and that's all they had. Some guy that could teach you how to milk cows, but what's that going to do for the vineyards? Nothing. And so getting this money and the funding together was a big deal. They did it. The first kinds of cuttings came over, which is 114, 115, 113, 114, 115. And then we kind of had the second phase more recently, which is 667, 777. And we'll talk about some other clones and special selections like the Curry stuff and 2A. 2A is a very special thing, and I had Janie kind of concentrate on talking about 2A, which is a Wadensville clone. And I think that one of the reasons it works is because it's a Swiss clone instead of being a French clone. There's only a few of those. And in fact, David Lett, he didn't even have clone 2A originally. It was clone 1A from what we've known. You don't find much 1A out there, but 2A really works. And so this was another thing that was really special, is just that the development of these clones. Here in California, we get a lot of these clones. You see 667, 777, all these things down here, and it's because of Oregon and the Oregon State University and these great vendors of Willamette Valley. The other thing I would just touch on real quick, and then we'll get into the conversation about each wine, is just the fact that there's one of the greatest events that happens every year, and that's called the International Pinot Noir Celebration. It happens in McMinnville. It's an amazing event. We've all been to it. We all love it. And it's about the sharing of information. And the original idea in founding IPNC was a great one. They wanted to get some French producers there. I mean, it's cool. You know, you come, bring your Burgundy ideas. We'll learn from you. You learn from us, but you kind of like us, and then we'll get some cuttings from you, and it'll all work out. And then they invite a little bit of California producers too, with an idea that, well, we start it here, then we go to Burgundy next year, right? And then we go to California the year after that, right? Well, all the people that came up the original year said, okay, great. When do we get to come back to Oregon? And that's how it kind of started. It didn't become a thing where it rotated. It just, we all go to Oregon to go to it. And it's become one of the most celebrated events of the year for all of us. And obviously last year that did not happen physically, but they did some great events online, and I think that we all learned from that too. So I highly promote that. And I would just want to say one word before I forget, give a little shout out to Jim Clendenin, who just died. He was an amazing person and a big person that was involved in that IPNC in a big way. So with that being said, I wanted to give you an overview, and that's a pretty fast overview of a lot of stuff from Oregon. But to get us going, I have the Great Brooks wine here, and this is Temperance Hill. And we're going to get Janie to come on. And Janie, it's so great to see you. You know how much I love you and the brand. But just tell us about the family story and really how it all started and why you made that decision to go in this direction, and about your farming practices to start with.
Sure. So my brother, Jimmy Brooks, started the winery back in 1998, and he had spent 6 years over in Europe, and that's really where he got the wine bug, working in Beaujolais. But he ended up having a family, getting married and having a baby, and thought it would be time to come back to our home state of Oregon to raise his family. So they moved back here in 1996, and he took a job right away as the vineyard manager at Willackenzie Winery. And that's where he started the Brooks brand in 1998. And he was pretty emphatic about returning the style of Pinot Noir back to the founders, making more high acid, food friendly Pinot Noirs. He was determined to restore the reputation of Riesling in Oregon. So that is a big focus for us. And he also brought with him biodynamic farming. So he started a group in the late 90s that still snippets of it still meet today about biodynamic farming. He moved from Willackenzie to Maysara in 2000, and then he unexpectedly passed away in 2004 at the age of 38 from an aortic dissection. I live in California still, and I got to his house the night that he passed away and was surrounded by this community of winemakers and friends of his that, you know, they said harvest was in a couple of weeks. And mind you, I knew nothing about wine, except that I liked big buttery Chardonnays from California. But they, you know, they said harvest was coming, and they figured out what growers he was buying fruit from. And they offered to take the fruit that year and make the wine, and to give me a little bit of time to try to figure out what I wanted to do. And I just fell in love with the community, with the people, with the industry, the generosity. I mean, I had never worked in an industry where you actually help each other and you meant it. I was fascinated by wine. I immediately took a class at UC Davis about viticulture and enology because I did not understand half the acronyms and terms that were being used when I would meet with these people. And that next spring, my brother's assistant winemaker approached me and said, I think we should give this a shot and try to keep the brand going, because having the winery was really the only thing my brother talked about being able to leave to his son, Pascal, who was 8 at the time that Jimmy passed away. So we decided to give it a shot, and crazy enough, here we are 16 and a half years later. Chris was my brother's assistant winemaker, so he's super true to Jimmy's philosophy. It's who he learned how to make wine from.
Amazing guy. And I'll say one thing too about Jimmy, everyone too. He was actually a linebacker, hit pretty hard there in Southern Oregon, played some mean football. Amazing guy. I think, Adam, you remember the great paella dinners that we would have with him. He made some mean paella. So good, and such a great thing to bring people together, people that sometimes didn't know each other, and just a real genuine character of, you know, like we think, you know, he's just that big of a guy that his spirit lives on in all of us. So it's really an important thing there, I think, in so many ways. And Janie, I think that one of the great things too is where Jimmy decided to really set up shop. And so tell us a little bit about this area there near the little town of Amity. And if you guys know, I'll say one thing, obviously so many people that want to go to Oregon fly into Portland. That's great. You rent a car, you just slide down. It takes about 45 minutes to get to, you know, right about where you're you know, kind of getting into the area past Beaverton and all of that. And you're kind of getting towards Newburgh and these little towns. But if you actually drive to Oregon, especially from California, go up towards Amity. An easy route to get there is through Salem, through the little capital there of the state. So it's really an interesting area, but you start to see a very big thing about Oregon right away. And that is, there's agriculture other than grapes there, and it's really big time. And in fact, besides the grapes and everything, it is such a great place for nuts, for berries, for a lot of turf out there. That all you guys that play golf, guess what? You've probably been standing on Oregon grass a lot in your life. So this is a really great thing. So when you kind of go towards Amity, you're kind of going along the hillside there. And so it's going to be on the hillside will be on your west, and you're kind of looking at the more expansive area of the bigger valley out to the east side there. So tell us a little bit about, you know, why did Jimmy pick this area and what makes it so distinctive? And then we'll go into really about the special Temperance Hill and what makes it even different from the other parts.
Sure. So he discovered the Iola Amity Hills in his search for old vine Riesling. So back in 1998, when he started the brand, a lot of Riesling had been taken out. And so he really went on a hunt to find old vines. And so one of the first vineyards he found was the old Iola Springs Vineyard, or Iola Hills Vineyard here. That was planted in 1974. So Don Byard, who planted the vineyard, was kind of considered one of the founders. He's in a lot of the pictures, but he just wasn't really onto the wine side. But Jimmy found him and was able to contract for his fruit. So that's really what kind of put Jimmy in the Iola Amity Hills. We have expanded kind of our offerings and vineyard sources throughout Iola Amity because of what a special place it is. Not just for Riesling, but Pinot Noir. So it's a chain of hills. like you said, Chris, on the west side of the Willamette Valley. There are vineyards and wineries both on the east side and the west side, even though they're all still in the Iola Amity Hills. But our greatest benefit we have is we are pretty much in the bullseye of the Van Duzer corridor that you mentioned. So we get winds in off the Pacific Ocean. It's super windy today, but during the summer, it will change 15 degrees in our vineyard in the afternoon and really cool off those vines. So that really helps in terms of extending the vintage and adding a lot of extra hang time for flavor development down in this part. And we focus very much on high acid. That's always just been kind of part of our style at Brooks. Obviously making Riesling, same thing. So we've really just kind of coveted this area. About 80% of our Pinot Noir comes from the Iola Amity Hills. Riesling, not quite as much because we take what we can find, but we have a lot of sources. One of the people that Jimmy worked with at Willackenzie was a man by the name of Di Crisp, who was taking care of the vineyards there with Jimmy. And Di eventually moved to the Temperance Hill vineyard. Temperance Hill, even though Iola Amity is in the bullseye, like Temperance Hill is the bullseye of where those winds come in on the Van Duzer corridor. It was a vineyard planted in 1981. We had always wanted to get fruit from there, and we're on the waiting list for a number of years, and we're finally able to access fruit back in 2009. So we get 777 clone Wadensville and Pommard. Our blocks are between 600 to 880 feet in elevation, which is considered high elevation in Oregon or in the Willamette Valley. Volcanic soils, which would really bring out a lot of the bright red fruits that you get. And that elevation really helps to contribute a lot of earthiness to the wines that we get from Temperance Hill. So definitely one of our favorite sites.
Yeah, and I really smell that earthiness here, and I taste it too. I mean, it reminds me so much of a great thing that my dad and I used to go hunting for in Oregon, and that's chanterelle mushrooms. And it has that earth kind of tone to it. It makes me want risotto really bad. It makes me want duck. It makes me want salmon. It makes me want all those kinds of things that really are from the earth and kind of really have those kinds of things. When you have like wild rice with salmon, it's great. You know, it really adds to the exposure, and you use chicken stock and you do all these kinds of things that are so great. And it really, I just feel like that this wine has a lot going on in it. As far as that, the Temperance Hill, I mean, it's a big deal now. And I mean, like you said, you had to stand in line to get some fruit. And it's the same thing with the Shea Vineyard, which is another classic vineyard site. And I mean, when we talk about clones, we're going to talk about the Pommard clone in a few minutes here, and some other things that are kind of popping up. But the 2A, what do you like about the 2A one that we mentioned, the Wadensville?
Yeah, the Wadensville, and I think this is the only site that we get Wadensville from, but it always has a vibrant acidity, really heady aromatics, which I think is where you get a lot of the herbaceousness and the gaminess in this wine, but that is consistent from vintage to vintage. But it's not, while the fruit profile is really nice, it almost has more just delicate nuance for us. So blended with the Pommard and 777 really makes for a well-balanced, pretty wine.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, a lot of the times I get a little bit of, it really reminds me a little bit of root beer barrel candies with the 2A. And it just seems to be kind of consistent, but this wine has some age on it, and it's really kind of turned into a tertiary thing where the spices have kind of developed out of that, and it's become more like a sarsaparilla than a root beer, and there's some depth and some really interesting things, but I'm getting a lot of blue fruit characters out of this as well. I just really feel that this is showing great right now. And maybe you could tell everyone a little bit about your kind of the program that you have at the tasting room that people are digging into right now.
Yeah, we have an elevated tasting experience, and it's always fun to pick out the wine for that. And so we do some library wines for the Riesling side, but what we're doing with Pinot Noir right now is we've picked 2 vineyards, and Temperance Hill is one of them. So high elevation, cooler site for sure. And then we picked Sunny Mountain Vineyard, which is a little bit further south, lower elevation, always a much warmer site. And then we pulled wines from 2011, which was the coolest vintage on record in Oregon, and then wines from 2014, which was the warmest vintage on record in Oregon. And it's just been a fascinating exploration of both vintage and site and how they can play into different wines.
Absolutely. That's fantastic. Well, we'll get back to you in a few minutes, Janie. Thank you so much. And that's like a lot of great information about your area there. And then we'll kind of go on to Stephen. And I like how this kind of fluctuates a little bit. Now we're going to go for a little travel. So now we're going to get back in the car, go from Janie's. We're going to point a little bit northeast, slightly northeast. And we're going to drive through the McMinnville area, and we're going to start going into the Yamhill Carlton area. And this is an area that's really more of a hillside regime too, but it's got a different facing there. And Steve, tell us a little bit, just to start out with, because I love your story here, about what got you into the wine industry. Because when I remember in your records too, I mean, you worked in Napa Valley, and we'll talk about that in a second, but you were a pizza maker. You had a place right in Santa Rosa here in Sonoma County, and yet you ended up in Oregon. You're making killer wines. Tell us a little bit about your kind of way of how you got from point A to Willamette Valley.
Well, yeah, I had just a kind of typical story, you know, started drinking wine, went to college at U of O, and then moved back to my home state of Colorado, and wasn't quite sure what I wanted to do with myself, and started drinking wine. And one day, after about a year working at kind of a service job in an oil company, I said, you know what, I know what I want to do with my life. I want to get into the wine business. So I basically packed my little VW Rabbit and drove to Napa Valley, and that was in 1984, and I've been in it ever since. So when I got to Napa Valley, it was kind of interesting. For whatever reason, I got fascinated with Pinot Noir, even though I was in the middle of Cabernet country. And I think part of the fascination for me was that I worked for eventually I worked for a Mondavi property called Vashon, and they used to do blind tastings there. And the Mondavis were fantastic at that time. Anybody who wanted to attend one of these blind tastings could attend. Any employee, you could sign up for them. And the Mondavis, when they compared their wine to somebody, they always brought out French wines. And so we would go to these tastings, these blind tastings, and you know, they would have Mondavi Pinot Noir from Carneros, which they were just kind of getting into back then. And they would compare it to Romani Conti and to Richburg and Latache. And I kind of got hooked on Pinot, and I really was fascinated with Pinot. And so in 1986, I started making homemade Pinot from a vineyard that Clos de Val owned in Carneros area. And I was just hooked ever since. And then I took a hiatus and got into the pizza business because I couldn't really afford, I really wanted my own business, couldn't afford to do anything with wine. And so, but I was really into food. And so I started this pizza business in Santa Rosa and did that for 5 years. And then eventually sold that and met my wife. And we eventually moved to back up to Oregon, and I got into the wine business.
That's great. So I love the story. We won't end there because it's actually how you got this piece of property, but explain where the property is and really what it's kind of like looking at. It's how it's influenced by the Van Duzer corridor.
Yeah, you know, Yamhill Carlton, really different. My site's a fairly warm site, but we really have a lot of wind here as well. And you know, Yamhill Carlton is mostly marine sedimentary soil, so it's really totally changes the wines here. I mean, it's interesting because I've had a lot of people, I've had this said to me more than once, that people have said, you know, I don't want to offend you, but your wines taste more like California wines to me, which is really a funny thing to say, but I know what they're saying, because our wines, you know, in Yamhill Carlton has a lot of tannin in these wines, and a lot of fine grain tannin in Yamhill Carlton wines. And we have a fairly warm site, so the tannin is the primary form of tension in our wines. We certainly have decent acidity in our wines too, but I think that underlying fine grain tannin really is the tension in these particular wines. And I was just lucky to find the site. So I'm sitting at a site that where I'm in right now is in the base of the right at the taste room, and so we started about 424 feet, and we go up to about 550 feet. We're facing due south here, and generally a pretty warm site. We've never had a problem ripening fruit, except in 2011 when everybody had a problem ripening fruit. Hope we don't see another one like that for a while, but very lucky to find the site. Just was looking for about 8 months. My wife's father died in 1999, left her a little bit of money, and she said, geez, I'd like to get a piece of rural property and maybe build a house someday. Well, here we are 20 years later. We have the rural property with a vineyard and a taste room, no house still, but yeah, very lucky to find the site. It was not for sale when I found it, and really just lucked out on it.
Well, wasn't it the Laughlin? Can you tell a little bit about your road right there is kind of the Laughlin Road, and how you did it? You just picked up the phone and tracked them down and said, I want to buy this piece of land. Call me back.
Yeah, I was working for another winery, developing another brand at the time, and one of the women that I worked with lived right up the road from where we're sitting right now. And she knew these people that had this piece of property, that this south-facing slope, and they were thinking about putting it on the market. And they were descendants. The woman that sold it to us, her maiden name was Kathy Laughlin. And Laughlin was one of the original Yamhill County families. They still own a lot of stuff. That Laughlin descendants on a lot of different land still here in Yamhill County. So we actually bought the property in 2000, went up and looked on it in an April day, and the person on it knew I was looking at it, and wasn't on the market yet. It was the perfect size because it was only 21 acres, and it was just what I wanted. I always wanted to make wine just from one site, which has its own risk. But walked on the property and called the person up and said, what would you like for it? And he said, well, why don't you call me back in a couple of days? I'll talk to my wife. And I said, well, is your wife there right now? And he said, yeah. And I said, well, how about you talk to her right now and I'll call you back in an hour. And so he kind of went silent. He said, well, fine. And so I called him back in an hour, and he gave me a price, and it was high, but it wasn't outrageous or anything. Didn't dicker with him at all. I just said, we'll take it. And so the person that told me about it, her husband was a realtor, and by the end of the day, we put down earnest money and got the thing rolling. So
that's fantastic. I love that story. That was a great story, talking about that in that rainy day, drinking your wines, having a fun time. And it's, these are the things that, these stories of Oregon are so great. Tell us a little bit about the naming of the Lenne and how that came about too, because that's kind of a fun little one there too, that goes back to something that you talked about.
Yeah, well, my wife's father was an Englishman who died in 1999 and left her a little bit of money. And that kind of got the ball rolling. I had to go out and raise more money, but that kind of got the ball rolling here. And my wife grew up on this chicken farm in about 40 minutes southwest of London, and they had this little road going by the farm called Nash Grove Lane. So that's what we were going to call it for a long time. I thought, okay, we'll call it Nash Grove Lane after we bought the property. And then one day I was looking at this picture. I was looking at this black and white of my father-in-law, and his name was Lenny, and I don't know, it just popped into my head about Lenne, and I said, oh my God, that's perfect, Lenne. We're tying him in because we wouldn't be here without him.
Yeah.
And so my wife came home that day, and I said, hey, we're not going to call it Nash Grove Lane, we're going to call it Lenne. And she looked at me and she looked at the picture of her father, and she says, does this have something to do with my father? And I thought she was going to say, oh my God, you're a genius. That's smart. And instead she said, oh no, that's not going to happen. I had a very difficult relationship with him. That's not going to happen. And I said, no, you don't understand. It's got to happen. I know exactly what I'm having on the label. I know what the storyline. I mean, so anyway, I finally broke her down after about a month. And so here we are 20 years later.
Yeah, I love it. I love it. Talk a little bit about the challenges you've faced there. I mean, it's a hillside. I mean, it's pretty steep. You've got in this particular blend here, it's half Pommard, and then you've got basically the two different series of grapes that have come in. You've got some 114 and 115, and then you've got some 667 and 777. So you've got basically the old school Pommard, and then you've got, you know, these two other fragments in there. But I mean, what are some of the weird lessons? I mean, it's basically just, it's not necessarily like, as we're going to go into with Adam, where he's got different kind of curvatures to the hills and everything's not flat. Yours is really at a slope. And what are some of the difficulties and the lessons that you've learned from that?
Well, you know, I thought in the beginning that I was smart. I actually had another winemaker that I made partner, and he had been putting in vineyards, and because I knew that I really didn't know. I'd never been on a tractor when I bought this property. Didn't know anything about farming. I didn't know, you know, just knew what I didn't know. And so this was a really severe site. We have a soil type which is very severe. It's called peavine, and it's a poor form of Willamette soil, which is the predominant soil type around here. Most of the soil is in the foothills of the coast range, but you get isolated little pockets here, and it just doesn't have, I mean, there's nothing to sustain plants except weeds and I suppose grapevines if you're crazy enough to stick with it. So, but we did. We just we had no fruit for 4 years, and then we had very little fruit the 4th year, and then the 5th year was almost the backbreaker year because I thought we'd finally get some fruit, and they just wanted to survive, these plants. They didn't want to set fruit. So finally in the 6th year, you could just see everything had changed. The canopies looked different, and they finally got some roots down, and we started to get enough fruit to differentiate the different clones and make a few single clones wine. So this site, we just didn't know how severe. Now, I mean, we just had an idea that it was going to be difficult, but had no idea it was going to be as difficult as it was. And probably, if I had it to do over again, we probably would have irrigated the first couple of years, but we didn't have a water source. And that took me almost 3 years to get a water source up to the vineyard, which involved getting electricity, and you know, I mean, it was kind of a fairly challenging project. So, but you know, all in all, that's exactly what I wanted. We're here now. We kind of survived all that stuff, and I wouldn't have traded anything.
That's awesome. This wine's tasting great. What do you like about it?
Well, I chose this wine because it was a little bit, I thought, indicative of the vintage. That was a really warm vintage. We had a very early harvest that year, and this wine, it's almost half Pommard, but it has all the other clones in the property. We planted 5 Pinot Noir clones, and the cool thing about this wine, it's very fruit driven, not very oak driven. This, you know, a lot of people were in this situation in 2014 where we had a big fruit set and we had more wine and more grapes than we knew what to do with in some instances. So we had only so much oak to go around, and so this particular wine is mostly 2nd year barrels, doesn't have any brand new barrels in it, and I kind of like that about it. The 14 vintage definitely is a cross vintage. I mean, in the middle of the vintage, I never would have guessed what we got in the end because of the big fruit set. It really slowed down ripening. So we didn't drop a whole lot of fruit because it was so hot. I just thought, oh my gosh, if we drop a lot of fruit, we're gonna end up making these real high alcohol wines. So what we have are very moderate alcohol wines. They have firm acidity, and they remind me. I always think of our fruit and our wines as more black fruited. Yeah, black cherry, black raspberry, dark Bing cherry. But these are kind of, they have a little bit of black and red. They're almost a little more blue to me than we typically do.
Yeah, it's great. It's tasting fantastic, and we'll get a good food pairing from you later when we come back to you. But let's move on here with Adam. And let me say one thing too with Adam. I mean, his family, pioneers, no doubt. I mean, these people were really out there, like thinking like we can make this happen, and like, wow, that's risk. And I'll tell you, when you go to their winery, you'll you'll see what they were thinking, and it's really a great visionary family. Well, I do want to add in one thing though before we get into Adam here too. One of the other big factors that I forgot to mention that did make a big difference in the success of Oregon is actually, we talk about these crazy conditions that are going there, and you're really kind of wearing your heart on the string, because you don't know what Mother Nature's going to do to you in Oregon. I mean, sometimes it'll dump rain on you, and they ripen later. Like we're picking here in California, we're mid-September, we're usually done with most Pinot Noir. And in some cases, and we'll go back to Janie there, this vintage of 2014, Janie was wearing shorts in October. This is not common for a vintage, where you're wearing shorts in Oregon in October. This just doesn't happen. And so there's these things that you don't know what's going to come about. I do want to say one thing that this did intrigue others, and that's the French. And the Burgundy producers started to come into Oregon. And I'll say that the best example that we have is Domaine Drouhin. And we call it DDO, Domaine Drouhin, Oregon, because they basically were a great family-owned winery in Burgundy, and they had a vision of this place too. And you see a lot more of the investment from Oregon producers in Oregon, or from French producers in Oregon now, than we've ever seen. And it's because they've grown to very, very much respect this area as well. And it's because of families like the Campbells that they got that insight to begin with, and then they've gone from there. So Adam, great to have you on as always. Great to, you always call me right back. You're like, sorry, what do you need? I love you. You're my bestie. We have so much fun together. But your family, I mean, one of my favorite stories about you was just how you were, you remember Mount Richmond, which is like a big part of the winery and your properties and everything, but you remember riding the bus to school and like looking up at that hill and going, wow, that's so cool. And now you put it on your labels, and you purchase these properties. What were your parents thinking back then?
Well, both my parents, thanks, Chris. I'm really happy to be here. Both my parents are native Oregonians, and my grandfather was an apple and pear farmer up in Parkdale, which is kind of at the base of Mount Hood. So, they grew up working outside in agriculture, and then through travels and other things in their lives, they lived in the Bay Area. They just really found a love and a passion for wine, Pinot Noir in particular. So when they were contemplating a move back home, I think they smartly realized, and it's really fortuitous for me, that that they wanted to do wine and grapes, and they'd heard rumor of a few folks out in the Willamette Valley, including David Lett and Charles Corey, that had put some vines in the ground. But when they bought this property here at Elk Cove in 1974, there was probably only 100 or maybe 200 acres of grapes in all of Oregon.
Yeah.
So yeah, they were the crazy living off the grid, getting back to nature. I always say it's kind of funny. I went to school in Yamhill, which is a very small farming town, and all my buddies, parents did some form of agriculture and farming, and I thought I was just like one of the other farm kids. And then you quickly realize, well, we live in a tree house and don't have running water, and my parents are putting every last cent they have into planting 10 acres of a crop that no one really thought you could even ripen or do good things with here in Oregon. So I'm happy they took that leap of faith. And in addition to kind of growing up, helping as the volunteer workforce for my parents' passion project, in addition to that, I found such a love for it and came back and joined my parents in the early 90s to not just take care of the 50 acres that my parents had planted and grown, but really with a focus. And my parents were really supportive of that, of planting new vineyards. So you mentioned Mount Richmond, which is, you can see it behind me, with clover in the spring. We have 200 acres of grapes over there now, and we've continued to both plant new vineyards and also purchase kind of historic legacy vineyards from basically family friends that maybe aged out of of doing the work themselves. And we've been fortunate enough to be able to buy a number of those properties and can continue to grow Elk Cove. I love that, my dad made the wine from 1977 to 1999 about when I took over for him completely and he retired. And they're still, my parents are still happily owners with me of the winery, and they do all of our landscaping in front of the winery. So if you guys come and visit us at Elk Cove, you might see my parents out there landscaping. And yeah, they're really good though. They just let me do the wine thing, and they're happy to just, as long as it's successful, they're good.
That's great. Tell everyone a little bit about the different, where your terroir is there, why it's different than Steve's, because and it's a different thing, and you're closer to the ocean, as I explained to everyone, but kind of tell us about the kind of the hills and everything and the soil types there.
Yeah, definitely. And in addition to the Elk Cove properties in Mount Richmond, we do own vineyards in 4 other AVAs, nested AVAs. So I feel like I have a pretty good sense of the other areas. And what I love about Oregon, and you kind of alluded to this, is that we have a lot of differences. We have a lot of different soil types, elevations, and microclimates, but they're all really high quality. I'm obviously very in tune with the Yamhill Carlton, because we were the first vineyard and winery in that AVA, and we own about 300 acres of vines. But it's not to say that that's better quality than what's going on down in the Iola Amity or out in Chalem Mountains. There's amazing sites even yet to be discovered in Oregon. But specifically to your question, Elk Cove is, at the time, was the farthest west and one of the most northerly vineyards in Oregon. We're in the Yamhill Carlton, but we're kind of tucked up into the northwest corner, up against the Coast Range. So I like it because they're big properties. Because we're the close proximity to the Coast Range Mountains, we have a really good rain shadow. So we're cooler, but so we ripen later, but we can generally get through harvest without too much rain influence because of that rain shadow. And we think of the Yamhill Carlton as having a lot of dark fruit character, even blue fruit, as Steve mentioned, a little lower acidity than what you get in the Iola Amity. But, in general, big, our job is to kind of, there's going to be plenty of color, plenty of tannin, just need to get those tannins ripe and then carefully extract them. You're going to ask me about the 14 probably, right?
Yeah. And then why was that so special to you? I think that one of the most interesting things that you said to me is why, when we said it's going to be the 14, you just kind of like that, because you just like these kinds of things and how a wine can expand and be different than when we first might have tasted this back in, 16 or something like this, and young, vibrant, big, all these kinds of things. How's it changed for you?
Well, I think, 14 is a great example, and it kind of, you bringing it up that way kind of reminds me of the fact that as winemakers, we really only get, and my dad only got 20 vintages where he could really hone his craft. And I've had over 20 now, but maybe I'll only have 35, 40 in a lifetime. And every vintage is different. And they all mark you or scar you depending on what you experience. I remember the 14 as being a real welcome reprieve from vintage where there were great wines made, but we had about 7 or 8 inches of rain as we were leading up towards harvest. 14 in comparison was just a dream. Like Steve said, but small clusters, small berries, easy wines to love.
Yeah. No, this is tasting great, and I like those tertiary notes. Now there's like a really kind of interesting like dried blood orange peel kind of effect to it. It's really kind of come out there, and it's got some the blue fruit is still there, but it's more like those kinds of blueberries that are a little bit more hardened. And I've always felt this from your stuff. You're right. It doesn't have that really bang acid to it, but it's kind of sexy. it's more luxurious than it's not just bing, 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 and zippy acidity and everything. And these wines develop very well. I've got a lot down here in the cellar, believe me, of your Elk Cove. I mean, I've been a fan of it for a long time. This is from a specific little block. So, this is specific site. So this is the Bohème, La Bohème. So tell us a little bit about this and how this differs from some of the other sites that you work with.
Well, it's definitely our highest elevation. This is a vineyard that my parents planted in the mid-'80s. They didn't plant it in the 70s when they first started because it's really steep and really rugged. It's one of the highest elevation quality vineyards in Oregon, topping out over 800 feet. And it's also, I mentioned, the proximity to the Coast Range, and it's pretty wild territory out there. It wasn't in 14, but I think a couple years later, I remember sampling grapes out there in La Bohème, and at the same time, a mama bear and two cubs were sampling grapes just below me.
Yeah.
So it's definitely, it's not a, we're not in the suburbs of Portland out here.
No, you're not. It's an amazing thing, having driven out there to the coast so many times. I know, and I've been to your place many times as well. And it's such an interesting thing about Oregon. And I hope everyone that's watching this wants to go visit Oregon after you hear all these stories, because this is the kind of storytellers that live there. This is the stuff, it's big impact to them. They put their heart on the line all the time. But I mean, it's worth it. I mean, this wine is tasting extremely good right now. I mean, it's got so much complexity to it. It's getting to be more like a pie with that perfect crust, But that's not the oak thing that you kind of get when you really have it. This is more like grandma's kind of special stuff versus that big kind of showy stuff, and brioche and all these kinds of things that we talk about, and toasty character. You've always been good about hanging off that oak regime and just letting the vineyards speak for themselves. And this has always been one of my favorites, and I'm so glad that we chose this to be a part of this. This is great. So let's move on to Dan, because I want to get back. I definitely want to talk food with you too, Adam, because I know I've been to a lot of great dinners and stuff at your place. But Dan, now we're going, okay, so now we've gone out to Gaston and we kind of turning back. Now we're going to go back to Portland, and we're going to go down, I forget the highway's name, but we're going to go straight down there. We're going to drive towards Newburgh. But we're going to take a crazy left at some point here. We're going to go off a road that actually looks like Deliverance might be playing if you keep going up the hill a little bit more, because that whole Ribbon Ridge is not really a paved area. It's just kind of a wild area, and I think it's like where the wild things grow. And what led you there, Dan, of all places?
Well, thanks, Chris. Thanks for having me. Always like to acknowledge the pioneers of the Willamette Valley that came before folks like me for softening the ground prior to me getting here, making my path much easier. So I want to give them a salute. Ribbon Ridge is sort of kind of the back door, if you will, to Willamette Valley. It's not off 99W, which is our main artery. It's off of 240, and it is the smallest AVA in Oregon, and it is uniquely, pretty much uniformly marine sedimentary soils. Sandstone, topsoil. Very granular in nature. I mean, I brought a little piece out of the vineyard that I don't know if you guys can see that, but this walk in the vineyard this morning, it's actually raining here, so it's a little darker than it normally appears, but there's sandstone here and then there's topsoil kind of mixed in with it. But if I just put the lightest amount of pressure, it crumbles right in my hand. So it's very finely textured, and that makes it hard for the vines to get the water out of the soil, and that makes the vines grow deeper. And there is a real paucity of aquifers on Ribbon Ridge, so we're mostly dry farmed, and that, along with the lack of water, really helps us to get the roots deeper and get more of the complexity in the fruit. I think our wines, I think Steve said it, they're a little more tannic than the wines in the Jory soils. And they're more toward the black side of the fruit spectrum typically. Although the 2014 being a very hot year, I think we get layers of both red and black fruit and maybe even some blue fruit in there, especially when it was a younger wine.
Yeah.
Now it's definitely evolved in the bottle. It has a bit of earthiness now, and the tannins are mostly resolved. And I would say that, like, to me, one of the main features of this wine right now, it still has a good structure, but it's very smooth now. Very, very smooth.
Nice spice kind of components to it too. I mean, you're another hands-off kind of guy. I mean, like, let the vines speak for themselves. You have 12 different selections in here. This is crazy talk. So, you know, we talked about the Pommard, and I didn't say this, but Adams is pretty much Pommard. And we will let me go back to Adam in a minute. Actually, Adam, why don't you say a little bit about your Pommard, because it's the Corey clone, and so why don't you explain that part of it, and then we'll go from there.
Well, I think we could all agree that, you know, we were fortunate in Oregon to start with really good material. In fact, you know, there were lots of times when I was a kid, I remember Californians coming up and getting plant material off our selection here. You know, we call it Pommard. There were basically two main clones of Pommard in the Vadensville in the Corey nursery, and I'm sure we got what he had, and we love it. I mean, it's I think it's really served us well. I think when people think of Oregon, they think of those two clones because they really are the backbone for single vineyard, older vines. The new clones, the Dijon clones coming in, amazing spice and spice rack of building a wine. But I feel like we're fortunate to have the two Pommard and Vadensville start.
Yeah, that's great. I always love the Pommard clone in pretty much anything in Oregon. And I think that was the weird adventurer one. That was like the Explorer clone, you know, with 2A and that. They were the Explorer clones, but I get so much character out of those. The newer ones are helping the cause, but they are great components. And to kind of go into a different kind of level here too, Dan, and I think this is a really good thing for you to talk about. So you've got all the ones that we just talked about with the 2A and the Pommard and all this stuff, but you've also got selections from down here in California, you know, like the Calera and the Swan and everything too. So you've really created a whole tapestry there that's very different from pretty much anyone else's. And what the heck were you thinking?
Well, I was thinking that I wanted to give myself lots of tools in the winery. Not knowing how every vintage is going to play out, it's nice to have a lot of options. And I wanted that clonal diversity because I think it's one way to make a more complex Pinot Noir. But I went to a lot of trouble, and I've done 3 major plantings out here, and I've got almost 17 acres under vine. And we're getting ready to plant another 15 next spring on a new site that's right up the road. But in 2002, I planted 6 Dijon and Pommard clones, and those were all young vines from the nursery from Duarte in California. And, you know, they were some of the usual suspects, 115, 667, 777, Pommard. The one outlier that was in there was the Swan clone, which I do have some 19-year-old Swan clone in the vineyard, which is part of my oldest block. And then in 2005, I made my first 97 cases of estate Pinot out of those 6 clones. But I also planted another 5 clones, and those were all old vine cuttings. I went to a lot of trouble to secure from Calera, as you mentioned, in California, and then also from Archery Summit and Shea Vineyards here. And we bench grafted those here in the fall of 2005 and put them in the ground. We put them in the ground in the fall of 2005. So that brought me up to 11 clones, and I produced that first 11 clone version of my estate Pinot in 2008. And then in 2010, I planted 1 final block of Pommard and 3 of the low yielding Dijon Chardonnay clones. And those are now in their 11th year or 11th leaf. And I make estate wines. I make Pinot Noir, making 4 different Pinot Noirs right now. each year, and a Chardonnay, and then a Rosé, and a Pinot Noir Blanc. And those are my estate wines.
Yeah, you do a great job on those. You know, we had the opportunity to come up there and visit you, me and a few other media people. We had a fantastic experience there. You know, and it was a rainy day. You know, we just had a good time, and that's just kind of how it happens. But you know, you found this place. You were looking for this forever. And you're at IPNC, someone says, you go up and check out this one site up there, and you go up there, you know, it's a pretty much a horse pasture or a pasture itself, and you go knock on the door, and soon enough you've made a handshake, and here you are, the owner. You know, a crazy thing. What's happened up there? You and I mean, the area up there had great potential. Where's it at now? I mean, you're kind of the, you know, the executive of, you're the head board member right now of this amazing Ribbon Ridge appellation, which is a sub-appellation of Willamette Valley. It's a higher elevation one. What's happening up there?
Well, I mean, I have a pretty long history with Willamette Valley. I started coming here in the mid 80s when it was still fairly nascent, because I worked for Tektronix at the time. And one of my very first visits to Willamette wine country, I remember very well sitting on a bench on the top of a hill above a vineyard and thinking to myself, you know what, I really want to do this someday, on my very first visit. And then I had the opportunity to make a little bit of money in my career. And in the 90s, I had an import-export wine company in Napa. And that gave me access to some of the Premier Cru and Grand Cru Burgundies, and became very enamored with some of those and some of the smaller producers that really inspired me. The whole living on the land, doing the farming, doing it right, you know, organically / biodynamically, and you know, giving back, and you know, drinking the wines, farming the land, making the wines, the whole thing. I mean, it's amazing. You know, that's very inspirational, and was very inspirational to me, and that was what inspired me to do Utopia. And then in 2000, I had the opportunity to come look at a farm that was for sale down here, which was not a vineyard, but it is a vineyard now. It's called Le Pré du Col, and Josh Bergstrom farms it and makes the wines from it. And when I got down there, it was interesting because it was okay, but it's like, wow, that's the spot right up the hill, because it was everything I'd been looking for many years. And it was a pasture. It was completely cleared. It was 500 feet of contiguous, gently sloped, south-facing hillside, right at the top of the ridge on Ribbon Ridge. And you know, there were horses out there, and there was a small ranch house. It wasn't on the market, but I was ready to make a move, and I was like, well, I don't want to buy this property that I'm looking at if I could have that property. So I just drove up and knocked on the owner's door. He just happened to be home, and the first thing out of his mouth was the price. It's like he saw me coming. It was total serendipity. So
I love that. I love these stories. I hope you guys are enjoying these, because you know, we're talking about amazing world-class wines, but it's the people behind these wines that's so important to me, and why Oregon is such a destination for me, and I hope for all of you too. But Dan's story is a great story, and I think we'll. I mean, what did you get out of this 14 that we've been tasting here, Dan? This is a great wine. It's really standing up well. It has a lot of girth to it. You know, it's really stretched out, and I mean, it coats the whole palate, and you could tell me it's in 17 or something like that, and I would probably believe you, you know, because it just tastes, there's a youthful side to this wine, and it really fills the whole entire mouth. And I feel like in some ways it's those 12 parts that come together, that they're always going to be there. It's like the great ingredients in your recipes. You know, there's things that they come in, and they can have strengths in certain years, and they can, you know, they might be the best contributor later, you know, and they might be dull this one year, but this seems to be working very well together.
Yeah, I mean, it's rich, it's smooth, it's got layers of fruit, it's still got enough acid to give it a framework. The tannins are round, and it definitely has a spicy characteristic on the finish. So, I mean, it's pretty much everything you want in a little bit bigger Pinot, I think. I know in 2014, with all the heat, for me here at Ribbon Ridge and Utopia, it came down to, do I want to pick on the bricks or do I want to just go for a little more hang time? I opted to go for more hang time. And we had, as a result, very ripe fruit. I mean, I had a couple of Pinot lots that soaked up at, 26.1, 26.2 on the bricks.
Oh.
And, it was the only time really since I've been making wine here that I really had to, adjust the bricks. We do that right away in the very beginning after soaking up. And, that gave me, I ended up at 13.8 on the alcohol. So I think it worked really well. And to me, I think you told me that Steve mentioned that this reminded him of the 06. I think there's a good argument for that, but I also think there's a good argument that it's a lot like the 09, at least for my palate.
Okay. Any conversation there, you guys, about what this vintage reminds you of? I mean, we also had some really dump the years where you couldn't drive tractors in vineyards because the rain was so bad, and we've had some of the most historical heat spikes of all times, and especially a number of, this is the first of really a 3-year period there where they were very high temperature years. But what do they remind you of, Adam? What's your take?
Well, I think we've really been, I think, fortunate to have some really good vintages back to back, and they have been warmer vintages. But I think the one thing that I always have to remind people here that a warm vintage for us here in Oregon is still a very cool climate vintage, and bright acidity and freshness of fruit. Even in a warm vintage, if we can pick into late September, our nighttime temperatures are 45, 50 degrees. And to me, if you can pick those grapes at those low temps and get them into the winery, you're going to get freshness. And I haven't had any wines, even from the warm vintages in Oregon, that have a cooked or stewed character. So, I mean, if you like that character, there's plenty of areas that do Pinot Noir in that style. But I think what we are passionate about in Oregon is just more in the freshness, fruit, fresh strawberries as opposed to strawberry jam.
Yeah.
And that's what we're looking for.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'll say this anytime, when there's a great vintage in Oregon, it's the greatest of the world. I mean, there's just no doubt about that. I think it's really the challenges that you guys face, and actually how much you've learned along the ways that give you the tools to deal with those things. I mean, you have to learn the hard way. I mean, Steve's story is a great story. I mean, it's, I just threw them in, and then, I don't know, the tractors aren't working, like this isn't working. But there's even patches there in vineyards where you just go, Pinot is not a thing here. It should be we shouldn't be planting Pinot here. So I feel like, these lessons have been learned. The great thing about the Oregonians and the great, thing about the Willamette Valley producers is that you really share information with each other, and that you really work as small groups there in the sub-appellations as well as the big appellations. And I'll give a shout out to Morgan, the great executive director of the vintners and growers there in Oregon's Willamette Valley. A great friend of mine, came up from Santa Barbara County, and I got to know her very well, and she got to go up there with you guys. And it's a partnership that really, there's a lot of things, and I love just like sitting around with you guys, and especially IPNC is probably the greatest area ever, where you might be just drinking beer. I mean, it doesn't matter what you're drinking, but the conversations are priceless, and that's the most important thing. And I feel like this shared information and the things that we're learning from each other, me as a writer, as sommelier, as all these kinds of things, a wine judge with Carl, and all these things that we get to learn from each other, and it's a really special thing. And for me, being a conductor of these kinds of great energy things, you know, of these, and promoting your wines and in the ways that I do, because I truly believe in them, and I believe in Oregon, I believe in Willamette Valley, and I believe in everything about that's going on up there. I've watched the emergence of it since the 90s, and these wines are killer. You know, that's why we can sit here and drink a 2014 and feel very confident this is going to be good, you know. And I feel like this is a great thing, and why our show is pretty much the best ever, but let's not go there right now. So speaking of food talk, I felt like Steve, maybe you can start us off with like maybe your favorite pairing, you know, for this wine, that, you know, this 2014 vintage, what you were really, if we were just sit down at the table and you say, let's order this, what would that be?
No, some vintages in Oregon, at least for the wine we make, I wouldn't pair with salmon, but this is one I would definitely pair with salmon. I mean, these wines, these 14s, I mean, heat-wise, yes, it was like the 2006 vintage, but wine-wise, not really anything like them, because they really show moderation, and they definitely have some acidity to them because of the heavy fruit set and the delayed ripening. So I love it. Like, this is a wine I would love any day with a nice piece of barbecued salmon, for sure.
Me too. And I think that the char part of the barbecue is key here. Like, you can't just do it. I mean, you can do it in a pan inside the oven, but that's not the point here. It's really the char. And I think we know that from IPNC, and the ones on the sticks are the greatest things ever. They really are. It's like one of the greatest eating experiences we've ever had. And we know exactly how it works there. But I feel like the char would be a very good thing, because there is some texture, there's a bigness to this wine, and it's a fantastic example of something like that. Let's go to you, Dan. What do you think about a pairing? Let me just stop for a second too. Dan's wife is an amazing chef. I just put it this way. Carl, when he took me up there, I mean, this beef bourguignon on a Sunday, like right around, it's kind of like our Sunday brunch, you know, it was freaking unbelievable. And I mean, I'm still thinking about it. I can still taste bites of that. So Dan, tell us about,
for sure.
Yeah, tell us what you guys would be having at home with this wine.
Well, I think you nailed it. I mean, I think that beef burgundy that we had made by Kathy, and she might see this video, so I have to give her a shout out for that
absolutely.
Day, because
cheers.
that dish made with one of my estate Pinots, I can't think of anything better than that to have with this particular wine.
I would I buy into that 100%. Yeah, pretty much. You sold me on that. Adam, like, what would you be feeling?
Well, especially on release, I think Oregon, especially bigger style Oregon Pinot Noir, is just too amazing with game meats. You know, tip my hat to the elk. Elk tenderloin is pretty damn good with
yeah.
Like you mentioned the Centrales earlier. I'll, you know, my go-to with an aged wine was your guys' conversation about salmon. I also think that a shout out to salmon off the grill for older Pinot Noirs as a way. I mean, it's that Pinot Noir is by far the best, maybe the quintessential red wine for salmon. Where a lot of, you know, game meats and lamb and chicken and there's a lot of great wines that go with those things, but there's nothing that goes better with grilled salmon than Pinot Noir.
Absolutely. And we've had so many experiences with this. Janie, I kind of saved you for last because, you know, it's not just that you have a great tasting room, but you have a whole food program there too. Tell us what you would, I mean, what's this making you think of on your menu and what you're doing right now with your program there?
You know, the herbaceousness of this wine is really kind of what strikes me the most. So I'm thinking rosemary crusted pork tenderloin.
Ooh.
I think that there's just a nuance and prettiness to it. It sounds like it might be a little bit different than some of your wines, the rest of the wines. I wish we had all four of them.
Right.
I know. I asked that question. Are we going to have all four? Because then we could be doing this weird kind of like
next time
commentary next time. Okay, we're going to do it next time, you guys.
Yeah,
For
maybe
sure.
we can still swap. But yeah, we have a full-time executive chef at Brooks, and we we change our flights every month and she changes the menu every month. So there's just a great opportunity to have food and wine together with suggested pairings. And it's also very seasonal. We have a huge garden, and that's most of what gets used in our food as well. So it's a fun opportunity. I still have, I think, one more menu item for May, but I try to plan my trips to overlap 2 months because then I get both menus while I'm here.
Yeah, that's great. No, I mean, I had such a great lunch there with Claire. And hi, Claire, wonderful winemaker that works with Chris and Janie, and it's a wonderful relationship there. They grow so many organic and biodynamically farmed products, and it's the real deal. You know, this is Oregon. You know, Oregon is not just about wine. It's not just about, you know, cold weather. It's about warm weather, and it's capturing it. It's also about hazelnuts. One of my favorite things in the world is hazelnuts, and every time I eat hazelnut, I think of Oregon. I think about all these kinds of things about Oregon, and that make me so happy, and looking forward to my next visit there. But to have you guys all on the air with me today was really something special, because I just, you know, I was really moved by my last visit up there, and I think it's because we all had that kind of year last year, and it was tough. It was tough on all of us, and our appreciation of wine is more important than ever. And when you find these areas and you watch them emerge and become some of the best wine producing areas of the world, as Willamette Valley is, it's really something special. And the fact that, you know, the four of you do such a great job of giving your interpretation of what art is, and it is an artistic thing. You're not making huge, massive, you're not this huge corporation kind of company. You're all family owned and operated, and you care about the people that walk in the doors. And I want to give a little credit to Oregon Wine Board too, just in saying, you know, hey, that Oregon wine tour that you guys did and came to San Francisco, you know, back in 2020, right before all this bad stuff happened, was an amazing thing. And it made me want to go to Oregon so bad. And I did. And that's why we're doing this show. And I think you guys will, all the listeners out there that watch this show will really get into this vibe too, once they go up to Oregon and they understand why it's so special. I mean, there's reasons why people moved up there. And I think you brought up a great point there too, Adam, that I didn't really bring up, is a lot of these original producers, they all came from California. I mean, come on. The Campbells are one exception. I mean, of the original swing that went up there. All the rest of them were from California. Susan Sokol-Blauser and her husband, they went to Stanford, they went up to Ridge, and they drank wine. Oh, I like this. This is cool. We can't afford anything here in California. Let's go up north and look at what they did. You know, look at these people. I love where Dick Ponzi, like one of my favorite things that he ever told me is like, I've talked to every governor of this state about wine, and geez, you know, like, but this is where friendships come about, and why we're at the point we're at. And I just feel like every vintage is a great vintage in Oregon, and I always look forward to talking to you guys. And I really give you guys all a cheers for just being a part of this show tonight, or, you know, whichever time you guys are all watching it out there, viewers. But, you know, for me to do a special kind of show like this, for the Varietal Show is something very interesting, because I care that much about you guys that I can't just talk about one winery. I got to talk about all of you, and we got to talk about these appellations. We got to talk about clones. We got to talk about food pairings. We got to talk about everything. That's Oregon. Cheerios.
Cheers.
Thank you.
Big thanks to Chris Sawyer for his ongoing support of Willamette Valley, of Oregon wine, for his interest, his presence, his exuberance. And special thanks to Janie Brooks from Brooks Winery, and Steve Lutz from Lenne Estate, Adam Campbell from Elk Cove, Dan Warnshuis from
Utopia Vineyard.
And this episode and all episodes, you will find them on Chris's websites. That's the Varietal Show. And that is on SawyerSomm.com, as well as specifically on YouTube under Christopher Sawyer. I'm not sure how many episodes you've had, Chris, but I think you're in the
I've got over 60 episodes,
60
and actually
episodes.
there's a great one too with Larry Stone, that it was just me and Larry sitting there getting deep. And you want to watch something very deep, watch that episode, because that's deep. And I also did a great one too with Earl Jones from Abasella, which was just an awesome one. And that's how much of an impact this trip to Oregon had on me. I'm so lucky. People say, Chris, what's your connection with Oregon? Well, when I was in Astoria, one thing about that, I learned about the pairings of movies and wines. That was my birthplace for that, because guess what? Goonies was filmed there, and so was Short Circuit, and so was Kindergarten Cop. But when I came here from Oregon down to California and moved to Petaluma, I got to hang out with Winona Ryder, and that's where I don't want to say our ages, but I tasted some amazing wines that were really changed my life, and I understood that the character of great wines really is not about what it tastes like in the beginning. It's how it develops in the glass, and in this case, it's how it develops in the bottle. And I think that this is why we're able to talk on these kinds of levels now, is because the food cultures emerged. And I do want to say one thing about, the Oregon food culture. Oh my God. It's like, where are we eating tonight? I love that Oregon food. They've got so many great, ingredients, and they've got so many great farms there that it's beyond everything. It's a whole experience. And that's why I love it so much up there.
Very good. Speaking of things developing, keep an eye on Chris Sawyer and his career as Sawyer Somm. But please go to the winery websites and learn more about them. And particularly if you're interested in ordering wines, you can go to brookswine.com, lenneestate.com, elkcove.com, and utopiawine.com. So special guests, thank you. Cheers to the audience for watching the Varietal Show.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Carl. Cheers, you guys.